মৃত্যুঞ্জয়, তুমি হ্যান্ড রেজ করছো কেন? কিছু বলার আছে? মৃত্যুঞ্জয়, তুমি হ্যান্ড রেজ করছো কেন?
কিছু বলার নেই ম্যাম।
হ্যাঁ, তুমি হ্যান্ড রেজ করছো কেন? কিছু বলার আছে?
না না ম্যাম, হয়ে গেল।
কোন রকম খেলা নাকি এটা? নামাও। মৃত্যুঞ্জয়, তুমি হ্যান্ড রেজ করছো কেন? কিছু বলার আছে? মৃত্যুঞ্জয়, তুমি হ্যান্ড রেজ করছো কেন?
কিছু বলার নেই ম্যাম।
হ্যাঁ, তুমি হ্যান্ড রেজ করছো কেন? কিছু বলার আছে?
না না ম্যাম, হয়ে গেল।
কোন রকম খেলা নাকি এটা?
হ্যালো, তাহলে আমরা স্টার্ট করি।
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ শুরু করো।
হ্যাঁ, ঠিক আছে। सर्वेभ्यो नमो नमः। महदिदं प्रमोदस्थानम् अद्य यद् बांकुड़ा विश्वविद्यालयस्य संस्कृत विभागेन भारतीय दार्शनिकानुसंधान परिषद तत्त्वावधानेन द्विदिवसीयायां समायोजितायाम् आन्तर्जालिक विद्वत् संगोष्ठ्यां वयं सर्वे सम्मिलिताः। अत्र समुपस्थितेभ्यः सर्वेभ्यः तथा योग्यं श्रद्धा प्रणामादिकं स्वागतं च व्याहरामि। भवद्भिः विदितचरम् एव एतत् जून मासस्य 21तमः दिवसः आन्तर्जातिक योग दिवसत्वेन परिपाल्यते। तथैव इदानीम् अपि अगस्त मासस्य 29 पंचविंशतितम दिनांकं यावत् संस्कृत सप्ताह प्रचलन् अस्ति। प्रतिवर्षम् इव अस्मिन् अपि वर्षे बांकुड़ा विश्वविद्यालयस्य संस्कृत विभागः संस्कृत सप्ताहम् उद्यापयितुं प्रवृत्तः। एवं संस्कृत सप्ताहोद्यापनार्थं तथा योग दिवसोद्यापनार्थम् इयम् अन्तर्जालिकी विद्वत् संगोष्ठी समायोजिता। अयम् एव शुभारंभ समयः, परन्तु यावत् अनुष्ठान प्रतिबंधक विघ्न विनाशः न भवति तावत् पर्यन्तं शुभारंभः न स्यात् इति संगोष्ठी प्रारंभात् प्राक् शिष्टाचार परंपरा प्राप्तं मंगलम् आचरितुं संस्कृत विभागस्य प्रथम वर्षस्य छात्रं दीपज्योतिम् आह्वयामि।
ओम नमो भगवते वेद पुरुषाय नमः। ओम नमः श्री गुरुचरण कमलेभ्यो नमः। ओम गणनाथ सरस्वती रविशुक्र बृहस्पतीन् पंचैतान् संस्मरन् नित्यं वेदवाणीं प्रवर्तयेत्। हरि ओम सहनाववतु सहनौ भुनक्तु सह वीर्यं करवावहै तेजस्विनावधीतमस्तु मा विद्विषावहै। ओम शांति शांति शांतिः। अथ यजुर्वेदीय रुद्राष्टाध्यायः षष्ठोऽध्यायः। अत्रत्यानां मन्त्राणां वसिष्ठः ऋषिः अनुष्टुभादीनि छन्दांसि महामृत्युञ्जय शिवो देवता मृत्युञ्जय प्रीत्यर्थे ब्रह्मयज्ञयपे च विनियोगः। हरिः ओम वायगुं सोमव्रते तव मनस्तनूखु बिभ्रतः प्रजावन्तः सचेमहि एकते रुद्रभागः सहस्वस्राम्बिकया तञ्जुखस्वस्व हैखते रुद्रभाग आखुस्ते पशुः अवरुद्रमदीमध्यवदेवं त्र्यम्बकम् यथा नोऽभ्यस्य संस्कारद्यथानः श्रेयसंस्कारद्यथा नोऽभ्यवसाययात भेखजमसि भेखजङ्गवेश्वाय पुरुषाय भेखजम् सुखं मेखाय मेख्यै त्र्यम्बकं यजामहे सुगन्धिं पुष्टिवर्धनम् उर्वारुकमिव बन्धनान् मृत्योर्मुक्षीयमामृतात् त्र्यम्बकं यजामहे सुगन्धिं प्रतिवेदनम् उर्वारुकमिव बन्धनाद्दितो मुक्षीयमामुतः एतत्ते रुद्रावसन्ते न परो मुजबतोतिः अवतत धन्वापि नागावसः पृथ्वीवासा अहिगुंसन्नः शिवोतिः त्र्यायुखञ्जमदग्नेः कश्यपस्य त्र्यायुखम् जद्देवे कुत्र्यायुखं तन्नो अस्तु त्र्यायुखम् शिवो नामासि स्वधितिस्ते पिता नमस्ते अस्तु मामाहि गुंसीः निवर्तयाम्यायुखेन्नाद्याय प्रजनन यराय स्पोखाय सुप्रजास्त्वाय सुवीर्याय हरिः ओम।
धन्यवादः समर्प्यते। अनेन वेद निर्घोषेण अनुष्ठानस्य समागमिष्यमाणाः समुपस्थिताश्च ये विघ्नाः ते चिरं विदुरी भविष्यन्ति इति आशासे। वस्तुतः जीवानाम् अज्ञानम् एव तापत्रय कारणम्। तेषाम् अज्ञानानां विदुरीकरणम् एव प्राणिनां चरमं परमं च लक्ष्यम्। तस्य अज्ञानस्य नाशाय कदाचित् गुरुचरणानाम् उपदेशः साधुचरणा अत्र सर्वे समुपस्थिताः। तेषां गुरुचरणानां स्वागतं विभागीय अध्यक्षः सन्तुसिंह महोदयः करिष्यति।
सर्वेभ्यो नमो नमः। सर्वैरेव ज्ञायते यत् बांकुड़ा विश्वविद्यालयस्य संस्कृत विभागेन भारतीय दार्शनिकानुसंधान परिषदः तत्वावधानेन द्विदिवसीया आंतर्जालिकी विद्वत् संगोष्ठी समायोज्यते। वस्तुतः इयं संगोष्ठी योग दिवसोद्यापनार्थं तथा संस्कृत सप्ताहोद्यापनार्थम् अनुष्ठीयते। अतः अस्यां संगोष्ठ्यां समागताभ्यश्च सर्वाभ्यश्च स्वागतं व्याहरामि। अस्माकमिदं महत् सौभाग्यं यद् कार्येषु सततं व्यस्ताः सन्तोपि अस्माकं बांकुड़ा विश्वविद्यालयस्य कुलपतयः परमपूज्य संस्कृत विभागस्य पक्षतः हार्दिकं स्वागतं व्याहरामि। एवं बांकुड़ा विश्वविद्यालयस्य कुलसचिव महाभागाः अपि स्वकृत्यं परित्यज्य अत्र अस्माकं कृते अवसरं कल्पितवन्तः। अतस्तेभ्यः अपि प्रणामादिकं विनिवेद्य स्वागतं व्याहरामि। किञ्च अस्माकं विश्वविद्यालयस्य कला विभाग संकायाध्यक्षाः अपि अस्माकं मध्ये इदानीम् उपस्थिताः सन्ति। अतस्तेभ्यः अपि प्रोफेसर जयंत कुमार सह महाभागेभ्यः प्रणामादिकं विनिवेद्य स्वागतं व्याहरामि। अद्य तावत् प्रवचनद्वयं निर्दिष्टमस्ति। अत्र प्रथम प्रवृत्ति पदम् अलङ्कुर्वन्ति कलिकाता विश्वविद्यालयस्य ख्यातयशस्काः सांख्य योग दर्शन निष्णाताः व्याकरणादि शास्त्रेषु अपि कृतभूरि परिश्रमाः संस्कृत जगति मातृरूपेण ख्यातिं गताः सेवानिवृत्ताः प्रोफेसर संगमित्रा सेनगुप्त महाभागाः ताहि मातरः वयोभारं हेलया तिरस्कृत्य अस्मादृशां पुत्राणाम् अनुरोधम् अङ्गीकृत्य अत्र प्रवचनं कर्तुम् आगताः। ताभ्यः अपि बांकुड़ा विश्वविद्यालयस्य पक्षतः तथा संस्कृत विभागस्य पक्षतः सश्रद्धं प्रणामादिकं विनिवेद्यते। किञ्च द्वितीयप्रवक्तिस्थानम् अलङ्कुर्वन्ति अमेरिका प्रदेशस्य एलियाबेथ टाउन् कॉलेज इति संस्थायाः रिलीजियस् एंड एशियन स्टडीज इत्यस्य प्राध्यापकाः जेफ्री डी लॉन्ग महाभागाः। ते महाभागा अपि सततं व्यस्ताः सन्तोपि अस्माकम् अनुरोधम् अङ्गीकृत्य अत्र समागताः। ते हि महाभागा सदा रामकृष्ण विवेकानन्दादि भावानुरागिणः तथा भारतीय षड्दर्शन रसपिपासवः नैकान् दर्शनशास्त्रग्रन्थान् विरचितवन्तः। तेभ्यः अपि बांकुड़ा विश्वविद्यालयस्य तथा संस्कृत विभागस्य पक्षतः स्वागतं व्याहरामि। ये च इदानीं श्रोत्रीपदम् अलङ्कुर्वन्तः सन्ति तेभ्यः ताभ्यश्च स्वागतं व्याहरामि। सर्वेभ्यः पुनरपि नमो नमः।
सर्वेभ्यो नमो नमः। विभाग पक्षतः स्वागत भाषण दानार्थं सन्तु सिंह महाभागेभ्य धन्यवादः। इदानीम् अस्माकं विश्वविद्यालयस्य कुलपति महाभागः अनुरुद्धन्ते स्वभाषणेन अनुष्ठानस्य शुभारम्भं कुर्वन्तु इति। कुलपति महाभागा।
কি ভাষায় বলবো সেটা একটা সমস্যা, মানে which language should I use? I don't know Sanskrit, so therefore I can't speak in Sanskrit. Can I speak in English?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much for organizing this very wonderful webinar for 2 days, as I could understand. In fact, I liked the song in the beginning, which actually created the proper kind of ambience for this kind of webinar. And every year, Department of Sanskrit, especially under the leadership of Shuntu Singho, works it out, contributes much to our knowledge dissemination in relation to Sanskrit studies. And I have heard from the organizers that it's going to be associated with the ideals of yoga. Actually, as I can see, I don't have real much knowledge about this, so I'm not. It's not appropriate for me to comment on this. But as I can see, as an Indian, that yoga is something which reflects on the mind as well as the body. It is the unification of the mind and the body that actually creates a sense of perfection. If we go back to the philosophical principles of Plato, we find that he is talking largely about the importance of the gymnasium in the development of appropriate education. Why does he talk about gymnasium? When I was a student of the honors class, I actually began to ask myself, why does Plato talk about gymnasium as a mode of education, as a means of education? And there, Plato actually is saying that education is of two kinds. In Greek language, the word education is paideia. And he says that paideia actually is twofold. On the one hand, it's the mind, it is the training of the mind. It's the training of the mind through discursive studies. And again, at the same time, it requires the training of the body, which actually explicates the importance of the gymnasium. So it is this wonderful combination of the mind and the body that actually was stressed in the ancient world. By ancient world, I'm referring to the entire part of that civilized world, India, along with some other parts I associated with it. So that's why it is the development of the mind as well as of the body that actually comes through the idea of yoga. Nowadays, yoga has largely become sort of, it is associated with some kind of commercialization. In many cases, we actually come across. But nobody really cares to think about the philosophical aspects, the intellective aspects associated with yoga. Dr. Shantu Singha has been talking about this to me a couple of days back when he was planning this kind of webinar. And I was really very, very impressed by this. And I express my gratitude to Professor Shangamitra Sengupta, and I have also heard the name of the scholar from the US who is joining us. And I can see that there are lots and lots of students and researchers and teachers, of course, who are taking interest in this. And I believe that it will be very successful and it will largely contribute to the development of our knowledge system. And I once again thank the department, the entire department, all the teachers, as well as the students, the participants, the honorable speakers, everyone for taking part in this webinar. I wish the webinar a grand success. Thank you very much. But I regret to say that I'll not be able to stay on because I have another work which is going on and I have to be there. But my best wishes to all of you. Thank you very much.
कुलपति महोदयाः तेषां व्यस्तबहुले जीवने सन्तोऽपि अत्र समागत्य शवाग्व्यापारेण अस्मान् अनुगृहीतवन्तः। अतः संस्कृतविभागपक्षतः तेभ्यः गुरुकल्पेभ्यः महोदयेभ्यः भूयो भूयो धन्यवादाः विज्ञाप्यन्ते। अस्मासु समुपस्थिताः सन्ति अस्माकं विश्वविद्यालयस्य पूजनीयाः कुलसचिवमहोदयाः। अधुना अहं तान् महोदयान् अनुरुन्ध्यां यत्ते स्ववाग्बारीभिः अस्मान् निर्मलयन्तु इति। Register, sir.
Hello. Yes. Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir, all the dignitaries assembled over here in the virtual platform, all my colleagues of the Sanskrit department and all other institutes, colleges and their students. The same problem lies with me also. It's really very difficult for me to speak in Sanskrit. So as the various dignitaries are there and folks from outside the state too, so it's better to speak in this. As what had been done by our Honorable Vice Chancellor. So I am following the pursuit of our Honorable Vice Chancellor. Really, my heartfelt thanks to Sanskrit Department for organizing such an interesting webinar on the eve of the International Yoga Day, perhaps. So, yoga, it's very much penetrated in our long history and culture. The main motto of the education is not only or any kind of the quest for the knowledge is not only for the development of the physical sense, rather its main aim is to develop the potentiality in all the fields, whether it's the physical sphere or the mental sphere or the spiritual sphere. Knowledge is something else, and what I personally believe, the intelligence is something different. Now, knowledge we can increase by having the information or by gathering the information in the natural science, physical science, or any social science or any stream. But intelligence is something different, I believe. Intelligence means how to maintain a balance with this materialistic life and the spiritual life. If anybody has any problem regarding the matter of the spiritual, we can say it's a realistic life. Materialistic life is not and can't be the motto of the life. And to the intelligence go above than this materialistic life, it's very much needed to have a kind of the practice of yoga. Yoga acts as a device to make a balance in between this knowledge and intelligence. Intelligence or the wisdom, it develops through the practice of yoga. So, Joe, practically I have a very list of knowledge regarding the matter of yoga, but I hope that the deliberations, what will take place in this webinar, it must be rooted through this knowledge, the ancient knowledge, what we had the master holding of this ancient knowledge, how to develop ourselves in such a way where we can develop a perfectly intelligence, wisdom to be a perfect human being. So once again, I do believe that this webinar, through this webinar, all the people assembled over here, they can be able to develop their cognitive faculty. With this off, thanks to all of you. Thank you.
Sir, a million sincere thanks
Santosh,
from
thank you.
the Department of Sanskrit to Professor Rai for valuable speech and cooperation. We hope this afternoon will live up to its graceful aura. Let us now welcome our Honorable Dean Sir, Professor Jayant Kumar Saha, to address the gathering and to deliver his valuable inputs to us. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Supriyo. And good evening to everyone. Respected Honorable Vice Chancellor, Sir, and all other dignitaries present here. Thank you very much for kindly inviting me to this today international webinar. which is very significant initiative, especially in this very challenging time when we are almost separated from each other. I heartily congratulate the organizers and particularly Dr. Shantu Shingo, teacher in charge of Department of Sanskrit, Bankura University, and all other faculty members of the department for taking initiative to organize this webinar on yoga. I feel extremely honored to be associated with so many subject experts. As speaker, Professor Sanghamitra Sengupta, Professor Jeffrey Long, Dr. Sheikh Sabir Ali, K.S. Mahadsaran, and Dr. Sri Putri Purnavati. I am really very thankful to them for taking part of this webinar. You know, now the country is going through the unprecedented time of pandemic situation, and due to the grace of technology, we all connect with each other, and we are taking advantage of that in this webinar lecture also. But I have very little scope to discuss about the webinar's topic because you know that I am not the expert of this particular subject. But still, I must say that yoga is a beautiful physical, mental, and spiritual practice that is adopted in India. And it is very much related to making a healthy body and a healthy mind. It is a beautiful exercising practice that links the soul to nature and keeps fit and active. And of course, it relaxes and calms the soul and mind. And we know that it also brings together physical and mental disciplines to achieve a peaceful body and mind. Sir has already said, Register Sir also has already said, and it helps manage stress and anxiety and keeps you relaxing. So I hope all the speakers gives us their dimension on these issues, and we'll have a very interesting interactive session, and we all are taking benefit of it and getting enriched by all the speakers in this international webinar. So without wasting further time, I hand over the mic to the moderator of this webinar.
धन्यवादाः प्रदीयन्ते बांकुड़ा विश्वविद्यालयस्य कलानीति विभाग संकायाध्यक्षेभ्यः प्रोफेसर महाभागेभ्यः इदानीं संघमित्रा सेनगुप्त महाभागाः अनुरुध्यन्ते स्वकीय वचः उपस्थापनार्थं। मैडम
मान्य कुलपति महोदय, सम्माननीय सुधीजन, सुधीजनानि विद्यार्थिनः, बांकुड़ा विश्वविद्यालय संस्कृत विभाग समायोजितायां संगोष्ठ्यां वक्तव्योपस्थापनाय आमन्त्रिताहं परमां प्रीतिमापन्नास्मि। अत्रालोचने पतंजलि सम्मतं योग स्वरूपं प्रकाशपदवीम् अवाप्स्यति। दर्शनशास्त्रं नाम कश्चन अभिनव सन्देशो मानवनिवासस्य। एतच्च दार्शनिकानां विचारवैचित्र्यात् बहुविधं प्रतिभातेषु असाधारण वैशिष्ट्यवत्सु दर्शनेषु पातञ्जलं योगदर्शनं नाम किमपि सर्वातिशायि वस्तु। पातञ्जल योगदर्शनं प्रतिपिपादयितस्य योगस्य महिमा सर्वैः दर्शनैरपि पुरतः। महर्षि गौतम समाधि विशेषाभ्यासादिति सूत्रेण अभिधदौ समाधि विशेषाभ्यासेन तत्त्वज्ञानम् उत्पद्यते इति।
वैशेषिकैरपि योगस्य महिमा अभ्युपगता तथा च वैशेषिकं सूत्रम् आत्ममनस संयोगात् आत्मप्रत्यक्षम् इति। योगस्य सार्थक्यं वदताम् बादरायणेन अभिहितं ध्यानात् चेत् महर्षि कपिलेन प्रोक्तमस्ति रागोपहति ध्यानं ध्यानं निर्विषयं मनः इत्यपि तदीयमेव सूत्रम्। योगः समाधि अथ समाधि सर्व दुख कारण अविद्या उच्छेदक अपरोक्ष विवेक ज्ञानस्य उत्पादकत्वात् समूल दुख निवृत्ति हेतु भवति इति प्रयत्न विशेषेण अनुष्ठातव्योऽयं योगः। योगे इति धातु घञ् प्रत्ययेन योग शब्द निष्पत्ति पुराणादि शास्त्र ग्रंथे योग शब्द संयोगार्थी प्रयुज्यते। उक्तञ्च विष्णु पुराणे आत्म प्रयत्न सापेक्षा विशिष्टाया मनोगति तस्या ब्रह्मणि संयोग योगो इत्यभिधीयते। तथा चोक्तं योगी याज्ञवल्क्ये संयोगो योगो इत्युक्तो जीवात्मो परमात्मनो। आचार्यवर्य पतंजलि स्वकीयां विशिष्टां सरणिम् अनुसृत्य योग शब्दं व्याचष्टे। तन्मते योगश्चित्तवृत्ति निरोध रूपः जुज् समाधौ इति समाधिबोधक जुज् धातु निष्पन्नोऽयं योग शब्दः। योग स्वरूपं विवृण्वत् योगश्चित्तवृत्ति निरोध इति पातञ्जलं सूत्रं सुप्रचरत् अस्ति। योग शब्दस्य चित्तवृत्ति निरोध रूपो अर्थो वासिष्ठेत्युक्त तथा हि योगस्तद्वृत्तिरोधो हि। चित्तस्य वृत्तयस्तावत् तस्य अवस्थाभेदा। चित्तं स्वविषयेन संयुज्य तदाकारेण परिणमते। गुणानां प्रतिक्षण परिणामित्व नियमात् त्रिगुणात्मकं चित्तं प्रतिक्षणं परिणमते। परिणामश्च चित्तस्य विषयाकारेण स्वाकारेण च भवितुम् अर्हति। विषयाकारेण चित्तस्य यः परिणामः स एव वृत्तिशब्देन अभिधीयते। न च एतेन परिणामेन चित्तं भिद्यते, चित्तस्य अवस्थामात्रं तु परिवर्तते। तथा चोक्तं योगवाक्यकृता वृत्तयो दीपस्य शिखा इव द्रव्यरूपा भङ्गुरा अवस्था परिणामा। वृत्तयः क्षणभङ्गुरा ज्ञानानां स्वोत्तरवर्ती क्षणनाश्यत्व नियमात्। उक्तं च वैशारद्याम् उदयव्ययधर्मिणी वृत्तिमित्यादि। वृत्तयश्च चित्तस्य धर्मा इति ते वैशेषिकगुणा इति नास्त्येयम्। गुणवत्तेन द्रव्यरूपत्वमेतेषाम् अभ्युपेयं भवति। उक्तं च सांख्यसूत्रकृता भागगुणाभ्यां तत्त्वान्तरं वृत्ति सम्बन्धार्थं सर्पतीति। सम्बन्धार्थं सर्पति इति हेतोरग्निः स्फुलिङ्गवत् विभक्तांशो न वृत्ति नापि रूपादितुल्यो गुणो वृत्तिरित्याशय। याजनादीनि ब्राह्मणा यथा जीवन्ति प्रमाणादि व्यापारैस्तथा चित्तं वर्तत इति प्रमाणादीनां वृत्तित्वम् उपपद्यते। तथा चोक्तं वार्तिककृता यै प्रमाणादि लक्षण व्यापारै चित्तं जीवति ते तद्वृत्तय उच्यन्ते द्विजातीनां याजनादिवत्। वृत्तिश्च चित्तस्य अन्तःकरणस्य इन्द्रियद्वारा भवति। तत्त्वकौमुदीकृता प्रोक्तमस्ति उपात्त विषयाणाम् इन्द्रियाणां वृत्तौ सत्यां बुद्धिस्तमोभिभवे सति यः सत्त्वसमुद्रेक सोऽध्यवसायति वृत्तिरिति ज्ञानमिति चाख्यायते। विषयाकारधारणम् अपेक्षितं वर्तते चित्तस्य। नैयायिकाभ्युपगत प्रक्रियया विषयेन्द्रिय सन्निकर्ष मात्रेणैव ज्ञानं भवति। नैयायिकाभ्युपगत प्रक्रियया विषयेन्द्रिय सन्निकर्ष मात्रेणैव ज्ञानं भवति। विषयाकारधारणं तत्र नापेक्षितं वर्तते। तथापि विषयस्य सर्वांशेन इन्द्रिय सन्निकर्षाभावात् विषयस्य एकदेशमात्रं प्रकाशितं स्यात्, न तु सर्वथा विषयस्य प्रकाशः सम्भवेत्। नैयायिका अवयव अवयविनोर अत्यंत भेदम अंगीकुर्वन्ति। एवञ्च अवयव ग्रहणेन अवयविनोऽपि ग्रहणं स्यादिति वक्तुं न शक्यम्। अथ अवयवांशे प्रत्यक्षं अवयविनी अनुमितिरित्यपि वक्तुं न शक्यते। सांकर्यात् न्यायमते मन अनु अतएव विषयाकार धारणा संभवात् विषयेन्द्रिय सन्निकर्ष एव ज्ञानघटकत्वेन अंगीक्रियते। सांख्य सिद्धान्ते चित्तस्य मध्यम परिमाणवत्वात् विषयाकार धारणं तस्य संभवति। अतएव अत्र वक्तव्यं पातञ्जल मते तु मनो विभुपरिमाण विशिष्टम्। कथं तस्य विभुपरिमाण विशिष्टस्य विषयाकार धारणं सम्भवति इति सुधीर्भिर्विभाव्यम्। मुषानिषिक्त द्रुतताम्बवत् चित्तं विषयाकारं गृह्णाति इति पतञ्जलिराशयः। आचार्य पतञ्जलि मते चित्तवृत्तयः पञ्चविधा। उक्तं च प्रमाण विपर्जय विकल्प निद्रा स्मृतयः इति। वृत्तिश्च ज्ञानरूप चित्त परिणाम इति पतञ्जलिरभिप्राय बोध्यम्। ज्ञानातिरिक्ता इच्छा द्वेषादयो ये चित्तस्य परिणाम विशेषा न ते वृत्तित्वेन अभिधीयन्ते। इच्छा द्वेषादीनां वृत्तित्वेन अनभिधानात् विषय प्रकाशनक्षमश्चित्त परिणाम वृत्तिरिति पतञ्जलिर्मतं ज्ञायते। इच्छा द्वेषादि वृत्त्या विषय नैव प्रकाश्यते, अपितु प्रकाशिते एव विषये इच्छादिरुत्पत्तिर्जायते। एवं वृत्तिषु पृथक्तया इच्छादयो नामधीक्रियन्ते योगशास्त्रवृत्ति। रागद्वेषादि क्लेशेषु इच्छादिरन्तर्भावो जायते इत्यभ्युपगम्यते। पातञ्जलिमते वृत्तिमात्रस्य उपादानम् अन्तःकरणम्। योगश्चित्तवृत्तिनिरोध इति सूत्रोपात्तो चित्तशब्दो हि अन्तःकरण सामान्यम् उपलक्ष्यति। चित्तशब्देन अन्तःकरणं बुद्धिम् उपलक्ष्यति इति तत्त्ववैशारदीकृता प्रोक्तमस्ति। अन्तःकरणं नाम मनो बुद्धिरहङ्कारश्चेति। उक्तं च समानतन्त्रे साङ्ख्ये अन्तःकरणं त्रिविधम्। एकस्यैव अन्तःकरणस्य वृत्तिभेदमात्रेण चतुर्था अत्र दर्शने विभागात् इति भिक्षुना यदुक्तं वेदान्तमताश्रयी तद्भवति। वेदान्तमते अन्तःकरणं चतुर्विधम्। मनो बुद्धिरहङ्कारश्चित्तं करणमान्तरं संशयो निश्चयो गर्व स्मरणं विषया अमि। पातञ्जल मते प्रमा अप्रमा निर्विचारेण वृत्तिमात्रस्य उपादानम् अन्तःकरणम्। अद्वैत मते तु प्रमा वृत्तिमात्रस्य उपादानम् अन्तःकरणम्, अप्रमा वृत्तिमात्रस्य उपादानं तु अविद्या। अद्वैत वेदान्तिनां नये विपर्जय निद्रा स्मृतय अविद्याया वृत्तित्वेन अङ्गीक्रियन्ते। चित्तवृत्तीनां प्रमाणादीनां निरोध एव योगशब्देन अभिधीयते पतञ्जलिना। योगश्चित्तवृत्तिनिरोध इति सूत्रे निरोध शब्देन किं बुध्यते इति इति विचिकित्सायाम् उच्यते निरोधोऽत्र न नाशो सत्कार्यवादिनी अत्र दर्शने नाशस्य अनङ्गीकारः। सांख्यसूत्रकृतात् कपिलेन प्रदत्तमस्ति नाश कारणलय इति। गुणानां विमर्दवैचित्र्येण चित्तं विविधं परिणामं भजते। तेन च परिणामेन क्षिप्तं मूढं विक्षिप्तम् एकाग्रं निरुद्धमिति भूमिविभागश्चित्तस्य। क्षिप्तादिषु भूमिषु सत्यपि वृत्तिनिरोधे न च स वृत्तिनिरोधो योगपक्षे वर्तते। क्लेशादि परिपन्थित्वाभावात् तस्य वृत्तीनां यथाविधे निरोधे सति गुणसम्बन्धनाशात् पुरुष स्वरूपे अवतिष्ठते। तथाविधो निरोधो एव योगरूपेण अभिधीयते। वृत्तिनिरोध रूपो योगो विविध सम्प्रज्ञात असम्प्रज्ञातश्चेति। सम्यक् प्रज्ञायते भाव्यस्य स्वरूपमिति सम्प्रज्ञात। तत्र राजसु तामसु वृत्तीनां निरोधो जायते। सात्विकी वृत्तिस्तु चित्तस्य तदानीमपि वर्तते। योगश्चित्तवृत्ति निरोध इति सूत्रे सर्वशब्दाग्रहणात् सम्प्रज्ञातोऽपि योग इत्याख्यायते इति भाष्यकृन्मतम्। असम्प्रज्ञाते तु सात्विकवृत्तीनामपि निरोधो उपजायते। वृत्तिसंस्कारस्तु तदानीं वर्तते। तथा च पातञ्जलं सूत्रं विराम प्रत्याभ्यास पूर्व संस्कार शेषो अन्य। असंप्रज्ञात पराकाष्ठायां तु चित्तेन सह वृत्ति संस्काराणामपि नाश उपजायते। तस्यापि निरोधे सर्वनिरोधात् निर्वीज समाधि इति योगसूत्रम्। वृत्ति प्रतिषेधेन निरोध आधानाय योगांगानि अभ्यस्यमानानि स्युरिति पातञ्जलानां प्रक्रिया। तानि च योगांगानि कायो मतो शुद्धि सम्पादनेन उपकरिष्यन्ति एकाग्रताया। योगांगानाम् अनुष्ठानात् अविद्या अस्मिता रागो द्वेषाभिनिवेशा क्षीयन्ते। सम्यक् ज्ञानम् अभिव्यज्यते इत्याशयम्। सूत्रितं च पतञ्जलिना योगांगानुष्ठानात् अशुद्धिक्षये ज्ञानविद्धिराविवेकख्याते। न च एतेन ज्ञानमेव अज्ञाननिवर्तकम् इति नियमो व्याहन्यते। योगांगानाम् अविद्यादि क्लेशतनुकरणमात्रे सार्थक्यात्। यम नियम आसन प्राणायाम प्रत्याहार धारणा ध्यान समाधय इति योगस्य अष्टविधानि अंगानि। अहिंसा सत्य अस्तेय ब्रह्मचर्य अपरिग्रह यम। भारतीय दर्शने एते शीला भूषण स्वरूपा भवन्ति। अहिंसा भाष्यानुसारत सर्वथा सर्वदा सर्वभूतानां अनभिद्रोह। सत्यं वाच मनसश्च यथार्थता। अशास्त्रपूर्वकं द्रव्याणां परतः स्वीकरणं स्तेयं तत्प्रतिषेध अस्तेयम्। ब्रह्मचर्यम् इन्द्रिय निग्रह। विषयाणाम् अर्जुनादि दोष दर्शनात् अस्वीकरणम् अपरिग्रह। योग साधनेषु नियमो अन्यतमः। शौच संतोष तपस्वाध्याय ईश्वर प्रणिधानानि नियमाः। शौचं द्विविधं बाह्यम् आभ्यन्तरं च। बाह्यं मृज्जलादिजनितं राग द्वेष मद मान अस्वाश्चित्तमला। आन्तरशौचेन ते निवर्तनीया। निवर्तन प्रक्रिया च उक्ता सूत्रेण मैत्री करुणा मुदिता उपेक्षाणां सुख दुःख पुण्य पुण्य विषयाणां भावनातश्चित्तं चित्त प्रसादनम्। सुखितेषु मैत्रीं भावये दुःखितेषु करुणां पुण्यशीलेषु हर्षं भावये अपुण्यशीलेषु उपेक्षां भावये। योगम् अभ्यसत संतोषं समधिगमनीय सन्तोषात् अनुत्तमसुखलाभ इत्युक्तमस्ति पतञ्जलिना। तथा चोक्तम् सर्वत्र सम्पदस्तस्य सन्तुष्टं यस्य मानसम् तपः शीतोष्णादि द्वन्द्वसहनं स्वाध्याय मोक्षशास्त्राणाम् अध्ययनं प्रणवजपो वा प्रणवो नाम वाचक ईश्वरस्य। तथा च सूत्रं तस्य वाचक प्रणव इति। ईश्वर प्रणिधानं सर्वकर्मणाम् ईश्वरे समर्पणम्। तथा चोक्तं गीतायां यत् करोषि यदश्नासि यज्जुहोषि ददासि यत् तपस्यसि कौन्तेय तत् कुरुष्व मदर्पणम्। स्थिरसुखम् आसनम् आसनेन अङ्गानि मनश्च स्थिरतां भजन्ति। अङ्गानि एजयति कम्पायति इति अङ्गमीजय योगान्तराय आसनेन स दूरी भवति। तस्मिन् सति श्वास प्रश्वास गतिविच्छेद प्राणायाम स्वविषयासं प्रयोगे चित्तस्य स्वरूपानुकार इव इन्द्रियाणां प्रत्याहार। चित्तनिरोधे चित्तवन् निरुध्यानि सुरिन्द्रियाणि। विषयान्तर परिहारेण धारणायां देशविशेषे चित्तं निबध्यते। तथा हि देशबन्धश्चित्तस्य धारणा इति। धारणा साध्यं ध्यानं तत्र प्रत्ययिकतानता ध्यानम् इति योगसूत्रं वर्तते। एकतानता एकाग्रता इति तत्त्ववैशारद्याम् उक्तम्। ध्याने प्रत्ययस्य एकतानता तैलधारावत् उक्तं च भास्वत्यां तैलधारावत् एकतानप्रवाहम्। ध्यानकार्यं समाधि सूचितं च तदेव अर्थमात्रे निर्भासं स्वरूपशून्यमिव समाधि। धारणाध्यान समाधीनां कार्यकारणभावेन नियतपूर्वापरित्वात् इत्युक्तं तत्त्ववैशारद्याम्। प्रवाहरूपतामापन्न प्रत्ययो यदा ध्येयार्थमात्रावगाहि जायते तदा समाधिरूपेण सोऽभिधीयते। उक्तं च पतञ्जलिना त्रयमेकत्र संयम। तस्य संयमस्य जयात् समाधिप्रज्ञाया उत्कर्षो भवति। तथा हि पातञ्जलं सूत्रं तज्जयात् प्रज्ञालोक इति। सूत्रितं च पतञ्जलिना ऋतंभरा तत्र प्रोक्ता। ऋतं सत्यमेव विभक्ति इति ऋतंभरा। योगी भूतजयी भवति। भूतजयाच्च अनिमादिकम् ऐश्वर्यम् अधिगम्यते। अनिमा महिमा लघिमा प्राप्ति प्राकाम्यम् ईशिता वशिता यत्र कामाविसायित्वम् ऐश्वर्याणि। समाहितचित्तानां या सिद्धयो जायन्ते बुद्धितचित्तानां कृते या विभूतय सिद्धिस्वरूपा। सिद्धीनाम् अधिगम कैवल्य प्रतिपक्षा। सूत्रं च तत्र वर्तते ते समाधावुपसर्गा बुद्धानि सिद्धयो। समाधि साधनम् उपायद्वयं वर्तते। अष्टांग योगाभ्यास वैराग्य समुच्चय तत्र प्रथम उपाय। सूत्रितं च अभ्यास वैराग्याभ्यां तन्निरोध। तत्र स्थितौ यत्न अभ्यास स्थितिश्च प्रशान्तवाहिता चित्तस्य। दृष्टानुश्रविक विषयवितृष्णस्य वशीकारसंगा वैराग्यम्। एतच्च अपरवैराग्यम्। परवैराग्ये विवेकख्यातावपि वैतृष्णा समायाति। तत्परं विवेकख्यातेर्गुणवैतृष्णम् इति योगसूत्रम्। ये तावद् अन्तराया व्याधि प्रभृतयस्ते तावत् ईश्वरप्रणिधाना न भवन्ति। स्वरूपदर्शनमपि अस्य भवति। तथा च पातञ्जलं सूत्रं ततः प्रत्यक्चेतनाधिगमपि अन्तराया भावश्च। अथ के अन्तराया ये चित्तस्य विक्षेपः के पुनस्ते इति जिज्ञासायाम् उच्यते। व्याधिस्त्यान संशय प्रमाद आलस्य अविरति भ्रांति दर्शन अलक्षकुलितत्व अनवस्थितत्वानि चित्त विक्षेपास्ते अंतराय नवांतराय सन्ति चित्तस्य ते चित्तस्य विक्षेपका व्याधि धातु रसकरण वैषम्यम स्त्यानम अकर्मण्यता चित्तस्य संशय उभयपति विज्ञानम प्रमाद समाधि साधनानाम अभावनम आलस्यम कायस्य चित्तस्य च गुरुत्वात् अप्रवृत्ति प्रमाद समाधि साधनानाम अभावनम अविरति चित्तस्य विषय संप्रयोगात्मा बद्ध भ्रांति दर्शनम विपर्जय ज्ञानम अलब्ध भूमिकत्वम समाधि भूमेरलाभ अनवस्थितत्वम जल्लब्धायां भूमौ चित्तस्य अप्रतिष्ठा एते नव योगमला योग प्रतिपक्षा योगान्तराया इत्यभिधीयन्ते दुःख दोमनस्य अंगमीजयत्व श्वास प्रश्वास विक्षेप सहपूर्व विक्षिप्त चित्तस्येते भवन्ति समाहित चित्तस्येते न भवन्ति एते विक्षेपा समाधि प्रतिपक्षा स्ताभ्यामेव अभ्यास वैराग्याभ्यां निरोधभ्या ईश्वर प्रणिधानी नाति च निरोधः स्यात् सूत्रितं च अस्ति तत्प्रतिषेधार्थम एकतत्वाभ्यास एकतत्वम ईश्वर इति मिश्रपादेन उक्तं वैशारद्याम् विक्षेप प्रतिषेधार्थम एकतत्तालम्बनम चित्तम अभ्यसेत् सूत्रितं च पतंजलिना ईश्वर प्रणिधानात् वा इति प्रणिधानात् भक्ति विशेषात् आवर्जित ईश्वरस्तं अनुगृह्णाति भुजवृत्तौ स्पष्टम् उक्तं प्रणिधानं भक्ति विशेषैति उक्तं च योगभाष्ये प्रणिधानं सर्वक्रियाणां परम गुणावर्पणं तत् फल संन्यास वा ईश्वर प्रणिधानं चित्तवृत्तीनां निरोधे द्वितीय उपाय चतुर्विधा योगा प्रोक्ता मंत्र योगो लय योगो हठ योगो राज योगश्चेति ओंकारादि मंत्राणां इष्ट देवस्य बीज मंत्राणां वा जपेन मनोलयो मंत्रो योग तथापि मंत्र जपान मनोलय मंत्रो योग शिव संहितायाम् एवं उक्तमस्ति लय योगस्तंत्रे एवं वर्णितम् आनंदमय संभूत्वा ऐक्यं ब्रह्मणि संभवेत् देहं न तापत्रयेन तापितं स्यादिति हठयोगिनः मन्यन्ते उक्तं च घेरण्ड संहितायां योगानलेन संगत्य घटशुद्धिं समाचरेत् पातञ्जल योग दर्शनं राजयोग ग्रन्थ राजयोगस्य साधनं चित्तम् दत्तात्रेय संहितायां प्रोक्तमस्ति साधितोऽयं महात्मभिः राजयोगो मनोवायुं स्थिरं कृत्वा प्रयत्नत तंत्रशास्त्रं न विचारशास्त्रं किन्तु पूर्णावबोधार्थं योगानुशासनमेतत् उक्तं हि गौतमीय तंत्रे न योगेन विना मंत्र पातंजलनये दुःख संबंधं सुखं न भवतीति सुखाय न कश्चित् प्रवर्तेत तंत्र वर्णितो मार्गस्तु मोक्षाय सुखाय च कल्पतेति स्वातंत्र्यं तस्या प्रक्रियाया महानिर्वाण तंत्रे उक्तमस्ति तंत्रोदितो मार्ग मोक्षाय च सुखाय च उत्तरवर्तिभिः बहुभिः योगतत्त्वस्य आलोचनं कृतम् एतेषां सर्वेषाम् उत्तमं पतञ्जलिः
আচ্ছা মঞ্জিদি দেখো কারো যদি কোনো কোয়েশ্চেন আছে।
দেখছি দেখছি, এক মিনিট। এখনো তো আসেনি প্রশ্ন, একটু অপেক্ষা করেছো তো?
ঠিক আছে, একটু ওয়েট করি।
হ্যাঁ,
আমি তাকে
আর
আমার একটু জানার আছে।
হ্যাঁ, আর দীপজ্যোতিকে আচ্ছা আমি দেখছি, যদি ওইখানে কোনো প্রশ্ন আসে তাহলে এখানে পাঠিয়ে দে। হ্যাঁ, তুমি প্রশ্ন করো ম্যাডামকে তাহলে।
ম্যাডাম,
হ্যাঁ
হ্যালো।
হ্যাঁ
হ্যাঁ ম্যাডাম, ওই যোগ দর্শন সম্মত যে বৃত্তি প্রক্রিয়া, মানে তাদের যে তাদের মতে যে জ্ঞানের উৎপত্তি হচ্ছে, যেমন নৈয়ায়িক মতে ইন্দ্রিয়ার্থ সন্নিকর্ষ থেকে প্রত্যক্ষ হচ্ছে, ওনাদের যে মতটা ওটা একটু যদি বলেন তাহলে খুব ভালো হয়।
আমি বলেছি, তুমি বোধহয় মিস করে গেছো। আমি এরকম বলেছি যে নৈয়ায়িক মতে বিষয়েন্দ্রিয় সন্নিকর্ষ হলে জ্ঞান হয়, কেমন? কিন্তু যোগ মতে চিত্ত বিষয়াকার ধারণ করে, বিষয়াকার ধারণই চিত্তের বৃত্তি, কেমন? বিষয়কে সংযুক্ত চিত্তম বিষয়াকারেণ পরিণামতে, চিত্তস্য দ্বিবিধং পরিণাম नाम जायते विषयाकारेण स्वाकारेण च, विषयाकारेण चित्तस्य परिणामो एव वृत्ति शब्देन अभिधीयते। विषयाकार धारणं च विषय प्रकाशनं समत्वम्। ঠিক আছে?
হ্যাঁ ম্যাডাম, হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, প্রণাম ম্যাডাম। আচ্ছা ম্যাডাম, আমরা একটু দেখে নি, যদি কারো কোনো কোয়েশ্চেন থাকে একটু ওয়েট করে নি।
এটা কোনো সন্ত কোনো প্রশ্ন আসেননি।
এখন যদি কারো কোনো কোয়েশ্চেন থাকে ম্যাডামকে যদি কেউ করতে চান ডিরেক্ট, তো
হ্যাঁ,
করতে
জিজ্ঞেস
পারেন।
করতে পারেন, আনমিউট করে জিজ্ঞেস করতে পারেন, ওয়ান বাই ওয়ান। না সন্তু, প্রশ্ন তো নেই।
আচ্ছা
ঠিক আছে, ম্যাডাম ধন্যবাদ, আপনাকে অনেক ধন্যবাদ যে আপনি
অনেক আশীর্বাদ জানাই, ভালো থাকো।
তোমরা, আপনি যে সময় আমাদের দিতে পারলেন, আর আমরা আশা করছি যে ভবিষ্যতে আবার আপনার লেকচার শোনার আমাদের সৌভাগ্য হবে, আপনি আবার সময় দিতে পারবেন। ধন্যবাদ ম্যাডাম।
আচ্ছা মঞ্জিদি,
কিন্তু উনি তো হ্যাঁ এখনো জয়েন করেননি, তো আমরা একটা ব্রেক নিয়ে কি আবার 6টায় জয়েন করবো?
হ্যাঁ আমরা 6টা না, আমরা ওই 5:45 আবার জয়েন করি ব্রেক নিই।
ঠিক আছে।
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, তাহলে সকলকে
তুমি
একবার
হ্যাঁ 5:45 at 5:45 we will join again in this link. Okay? ঠিক আছে, 5:45 সময় আবার আমরা জয়েন করব এই লিংকে। এখন আমরা একটা ব্রেক নিয়ে নিচ্ছি, ঠিক আছে? ঠিক আছে, হ্যাঁ সেম লিংক, প্রণয় সেম, একদম সেম লিংক, এই লিংকেই আমরা আবার সবাই জয়েন করব। আর ইউটিউবের লিংকটা আমি জানি না ওটাই থাকবে কিনা, কিন্তু জিমেলের লিংকটা এটাই থাকবে। আমরা আবার 5:45 জয়েন করব, 6টা থেকে জেফ্রি লং এর লেকচার আছে, ঠিক আছে?
যদি চেঞ্জ হয় বা এটাই থাকে সেটা
আমি জানিয়ে দেবো। না, ইউটিউবের লিংকটা আমি আপনার ওই গ্রুপে দিয়ে দিয়েছি, গ্রুপে দেওয়া হয়ে গেছে, যে হোয়াটসঅ্যাপ গ্রুপটা হয়েছে না, সেটাই দিয়ে দেয়া হয়েছে। এবার যদি ওটা একই থাকে তো ঠিক আছে, এবার যদি অন্য হয় তাহলে আবার ওরা দেবে, তখন আবার জানিয়ে দেবো।
আচ্ছা, তাহলে আমরা 5:45 আবার জয়েন হবো সকালে।
উইল মিট এগেন at 5:45.
ঠিক আছে, ধন্যবাদ। দীপজ্যোতি, Yes. Sir. Hello, sir.
Hello. Namaskar.
Welcome, sir. Yes, sir. Namaskar. Pranam. I am Sant. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm not hearing very well. The sound is broken up a little.
Now we are starting.
Okay, now I can hear you.
After few minutes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. The first half of our webinar is ended, sir. Your lecture is now started.
Oh, it is begun? Okay, so...
No, shall we start, Shantu? Shall we start, or shall we wait for five more minutes?
No. I think that.
Okay.
Oh,
okay,
start now?
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so just 1 minute. Okay.
Oh.
Okay. Sir, on the behalf of the Bakura University, I welcome Professor Jeffrey Long. He is Carl W. Ziegler Professor of Religion at Elizabethtown College, USA. 15 books are published under his name, and 58 papers are authored by him. The topics of the books and his papers are varied from Indian philosophy to Hinduism, along with Buddhism and Jainism. Sir, I welcome you again in this session.
Thank you very much. Namaskar. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Very good. Let me see if I can share my screen. Let's see. Can all of you see this picture
Yes,
of Swami Vivekananda?
Yes, sir.
Very good. Very good. So then I will begin. So my topic today is Raja Yoga, Swami Vivekananda's interpretation of the Yoga Sutra. So a few words about Swami Vivekananda. I imagine most of you are familiar with him. You are, most of you, I think, in Bengal, so Swamiji's homeland. But for any who are not familiar with him, he lived in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. From 12th January, he was born in 1863 and died on the 4th of July, left his body in 1902. Interestingly, the 4th of July is the Independence Day of the United States, just as 15th August was recently the Independence Day of India. And Swamiji had a great fondness for America. He spent a good deal of time here, as many of you know. And I've always found it interesting that he left his body on the American Independence Day, 4th of July. His name at birth was Narendranath Datta, and he was born in Kolkata. And he received a Western education growing up, was educated by people from England and Scotland. And he became very skeptical about religion. He had been raised Hindu and been taught the traditional things. But his education made him question and wonder, is God real? Does God exist? And he asked many people, have you seen God? He went to some of the great minds of Calcutta of his time. And it was a time when there were a lot of brilliant people teaching, people like Keshav Chandra Sen, for example. And he would go to them and say, have you seen God? And after asking so many people, none of them could say they had seen God. One of his teachers, actually a Scottishman named Mr. Hasty, told him, you should go speak to a man named Ramakrishna. He's a true man of God. And so he went to the Kali temple at Dakshineshwar and met Sri Ramakrishna, and he asked him the same question. And Ramakrishna was the first person to answer yes, he said. Sri Ramakrishna is said to have replied, I have seen God, he said, only more intensely than I am seeing you now. And this answer made a very deep impression on the young Narendranath Datta. And he was still skeptical for some time. In fact, he questioned Sri Ramakrishna throughout his lifetime. But he soon became his ardent disciple and was a follower of Sri Ramakrishna until Sri Ramakrishna passed away. And then he became Swami Vivekananda. He took monastic vows, and he organized the other disciples of Ramakrishna together into the Ramakrishna order and established the Ramakrishna mission in 1897. But even before that, in 1893, he would famously travel to America and speak at the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago, and his welcome address was extremely well received and really led to his great fame in America. In 1894, he established the first Vedanta Society in New York. Today, there are many Vedanta societies across the United States, and in fact, including in my own home, we have the Vedanta Society of Central Pennsylvania. So Swami Vivekananda played a great role, really the decisive role in establishing this tradition in the U.S., but also did great work in India establishing the Ramakrishna Mission, which is continues to be the largest relief and charity organization in India to the present day, and has done enormous work for education, poverty relief, and of course, spiritual teaching as well. Building on his master's teaching, Sri Ramakrishna's teaching, Swami Vivekananda would emphasize religious pluralism. That is the idea that all religions have some truth and can lead to God realization, and an attitude of renunciation, or as he often said, self-abnegation. That is giving up the ego, giving up the sense of the little I that tends to dominate our lives. He further elaborated the concept of the four yogas as independently effective methods for attaining God realization. This concept of many yogas has existed for a long time in India. In fact, you can find it in the Bhagavad Gita itself. Sri Ramakrishna taught this as well. But Swami Vivekananda can be credited with systematizing it and really presenting it in a way which made it understandable for the world. So, how does Swami Vivekananda interpret the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali? That's our topic today. What is his understanding of the Yoga Sutras? The basic principle underlying Swamiji's interpretation of any scripture, including the Yoga Sutra, is that he does so in light of the life and teaching of his guru, Sri Ramakrishna. So Sri Ramakrishna's teaching informs every interpretation that Swami Vivekananda gives of the Vedas, the Gita, the Yoga Sutras, and so on. He says this himself, "My teaching is my own interpretation of our ancient books, in the which my masters shed upon them. I claim no supernatural authority. Whatever in my teaching may appeal to the highest intelligence and be accepted by thinking people, the adoption of that will be my reward." And this is entirely consistent with Swami Vivekananda's philosophy. Right? He saw Sri Ramakrishna as a living example of the embodiment of the teachings of the ancient books, and so he read them in light of Ramakrishna's life and teaching. And his appeal was not on the basis of the idea that he was somehow divine or superior to others. Instead, he appealed to the reason, the intelligence of people. If something accords with your experience and your reason, he said, accept it. If it does not, then don't accept it. We need to, as the Buddha said, be a light unto ourselves. Specifically, if we look at the Yoga Sutras, Swami Vivekananda's interpretation needs to be seen in the context of the teaching of the four yogas, which I've just mentioned. So Swamiji characterizes the four yogas as follows, and you see the picture here of the four yogas, the Karma Yoga, Bhakti, Jnana, and Raja. So this is Swami Vivekananda's own words. He says that karma yoga is the manner in which a man realizes his own divinity through works and duty. Now, Swamiji often would talk about man. Today, we would probably use the term humanity. There is no evidence that Swamiji intended to exclude women or anyone other than men from his teaching. And in fact, most of his closest disciples in the US were women, and most famously, Sister Nivedita. So when he says man, he means humanity. But I'm being true to his original language here. Bhakti Yoga, the realization of divinity through devotion to and love of a personal God. Raja Yoga, our topic today, the realization of divinity through the control of mind. And Jnana Yoga, the realization of a man's own divinity through knowledge. So these are the four yogas. And so when we look at the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali through the lens of Swami Vivekananda's teaching, we are looking at Raja Yoga, right? The system of Patanjali is understood by Swami Vivekananda as an expression of this yoga, the yoga of the control of the mind. According to Swami Vivekananda, there are many yogas, many paths to God realization because of the differences in human temperaments. He says, every man, again, every one, must develop according to his own nature. As every science has its methods, so has every religion. The methods of attaining the end of religion are called yoga by us, and the different forms of yoga that we teach are adapted to the different natures and temperaments of men. So this is why there are many yogas. And in fact, in another part of his complete works, Swami Vivekananda says there are, in fact, as many yogas as there are living beings on the path. So when we talk of four yogas, we're really talking of four tendencies that are present across all of our paths, all of the many yogas. The yogas are not mutually exclusive. In fact, Swamiji encourages people to incorporate elements of all four yogas into their path, but the precise combination will be distinctive to each person, and we, in general, one of the four will tend to predominate because of our own dispositions. So the diversity of the paths to God realization forms the basis for Swami Vivekananda's teaching of religious pluralism. That is, the fact that there are many paths as there are beings, this leads to the diversity of religions as well. Swamiji says, the ultimate goal of all mankind, the aim and end of all religions, is but one, reunion with God, or what amounts to the same with the divinity which is every man's true nature. But while the aim is one, the method of attaining may vary with the different temperaments of men. Both the goal and the methods employed for reaching it are called yoga, a word derived from the same Sanskrit root as the English yoke, meaning to join us to our reality, God. There are various such yogas or methods of union, but the chief ones are karma yoga, bhakti yoga, raja yoga, and jnana yoga. And I want to call attention to this early part of this quote, where he says a couple of things. The aim and end of all religions, he says, is reunion with God, or what amounts to the same with the divinity which is every man's true nature. In this very short phrase, Swami Vivekananda reconciles two main types of religion we find in the world. There are religions that are theistic, that are focused on God and a loving reunion with God. So this is very much in the vein of bhakti yoga. But there are also traditions like Buddhism, like Jainism, for example, which are not so much about a personal God, but about realizing a divine principle within ourselves. And Swamiji here says, this is basically the same thing. He says, what amounts to the same? That these are sometimes seen as contradictory paths, but according to Swami Vivekananda, the loving union with God or the realization of God within oneself, these are just different ways of experiencing the same basic reality. And an image that could be used, I think, to compare these two. This is not one of Swamiji's own images, but it's one that I find useful. If you think of two different claims being made, one is that the sun rises, right? The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. That's one claim. Second claim would be, it's not actually the sun that's moving, it's the earth that's rotating. the sun doesn't actually move in relation to the earth rotates and it creates the appearance of the sun rising and setting. Now, neither of these statements is actually false. If you're standing on the earth, to all appearances, the sun rises and the sun sets. And if I tell you the sun rose a short time ago or the sun is going to set in a short time, you'll understand what I mean, and a very clear idea will appear in your mind. But if you're studying science, you're studying astronomy, you know that underlying that phenomenon, there's this rotation of the earth. So in the same way, someone might say, I felt a loving union with God. Someone else might say, I found God within me. I realized my own inner divinity. And rather than seeing these as contrary statements, we could see them as different ways of approaching the same phenomenon. Right? The dawning of spiritual consciousness. It could be the sun rising, it could be the earth turning. Both can be used to describe the experience.
Sir, excuse me. Sir,
Yes.
sir, I'm stopping you. Yeah, Chapon Pal and Humayun Islam, please mute yourself. Please mute your microphone.
Okay.
And why are you presenting?
Shall I continue?
Yes, sir, please. Otherwise the noises would come.
Right.
If they
No,
unmute
this
I'm
is
sorry.
one of the charms of webinars in India. So thank you very much. Okay.
Okay. Please, sir, continue. Please, sir.
Okay. So for Swami Vivekananda, despite the differences amongst the yogas and amongst the religions in which they're manifested, there's no true conflict amongst them. And this is what I was just explaining about the sun rising or the earth turning. They're just different models or paradigms for what is fundamentally the same experience. As Swami Vivekananda says, our various yogas do not conflict with each other. Each of them leads us to the same goal and makes us perfect. Each one of our yogas is fitted to make man perfect even without the help of the others, because they have all the same goal in view. The yogas of work, of wisdom, and of devotion are all capable of serving as direct and independent means for the attainment of moksha, that is liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth. Fools alone say that work and philosophy are different, not the learned. He's paraphrasing the Bhagavad Gita here. The learned know that, though apparently different from each other, they at last lead to the same goal of human perfection. Within the system of the four yogas, the teaching of Patanjali fit for Swami Vivekananda in the category of Raja Yoga, also known as Dhyana Yoga, the royal path, the path of meditation. Swamiji's book, Raja Yoga, is essentially his bhashya, his commentary on the Yoga Sutras. The Raja Yoga basically takes the Yoga Sutras and interprets them through the matrix of Swami Vivekananda's philosophy, his Vedanta, his idea of the four yogas. In the course of this work, he does not simply restate what Patanjali has stated, though there is a section where the original sutras are there and he's simply elaborating upon them. But throughout the work, he incorporates other elements of knowledge into the interpretation. There are elements of Tantra. There are, in fact, 3 whole chapters of the book are focused on the concept of prana. And this is prana, also, of course, also called Shakti, the power, the creative force at the heart of existence. And so he discusses this. He talks about the Kundalini Shakti, the coiled energy at the base of the spine. He talks about the subtle nerve systems, the chakras, the Sushumna Nadi, all of these things that you see in Tantric philosophy are incorporated into Swamiji's Raja Yoga. And of course also Vedanta, the overall framework of the four yogas, the idea of Raja Yoga as a path to God realization in a Vedantic sense. As Swamiji himself points out, the original Patanjali Yoga Sutra speaks very much in the terms of the Sankhya system of philosophy. And so if we want to be very literal, we say it's not so much about God, it's about realizing the Purusha, right? The nature of the soul, and realizing that is our true nature, and delinking from identification with Prakriti, with the realm of the physical material world. But for Swami Vivekananda, this is not a difference that is of any great significance, because again, he sees this system as something that's capable of being used in the service of the goal of God realization as he understands it. The study of Raja Yoga, he says, takes a long time and constant practice. A part of this practice is physical, but in the main it is mental. As we proceed, we shall find how intimately the mind is connected with the body. So this is very important, and especially in light of some of the controversy that we know in our contemporary world. The practice of yoga has spread globally, and it's very popular here in the Western world. And yet, much of the time, we find it is de-linked from the idea of the spiritual path, the idea of God realization, the idea of moksha. Right? These concepts don't play a role for many Americans, for example, who practice yoga. They say they're doing yoga, but they're doing the physical exercises that are part of this path. And what Swamiji is here explaining is that Raja Yoga, in the true sense, in the sense at least in which he understands it, is primarily a mental practice. It is something that we are doing to yoke our minds, right, to direct them toward God. And but a part of the practice, he says, is certainly physical. Things like breath control, asana, posture, and various ways in which the body is used and is transformed into a vehicle for God realization. The body is, of course, involved. And as Swamiji says, we find how intimately the mind is connected with the body. And it's, in fact, true for all of us that our physical state, our physical sense of well-being is very closely connected with our mental sense of well-being. And this is something that what medical science has been confirming for many, many years. We know that if we feel a lot of stress mentally, for some mental reason, something that we're worried about, something that concerns us, this manifests in the body, elevated blood pressure, various chemicals that increase, that place stress upon the body. And that when we feel happy, when we feel calm, when we feel serene, there are also chemicals released in the body, and there are effects which lead us to a sense of greater physical health and well-being. So these are intimately connected. And of course, the reverse is also true, that if something is giving us physical pain, for example, it's going to cause us mental anxiety too. And it can take a great effort to resist that the sort of physical world pulling down our mental state. We call this mind over matter, right? And it's something that one can learn through Raja Yoga. So as he says, the physical is part of it, but Raja Yoga, right, yoga in the true sense, as Swamiji would say, is not primarily a physical activity. It involves physical activity. And so this is a difference between how Swami Vivekananda understands yoga and how it's been sort of appropriated, you could say, as mainly a form of physical exercise. Swamiji does not disapprove of physical exercise, but for him, an excessive focus on the body would really be a distraction. The whole point is to attune the body so that it can be a vehicle for a higher realization. According to Swamiji, Raja Yoga can be practiced regardless of religious affiliation or lack thereof. He says, the goal of all Raja Yoga teaching is how to concentrate our minds, then how to discover the innermost recesses of our minds, then how to generalize their contents and form our own conclusions from them. So 3 stages, right, he mentions here. First, we have to learn how to concentrate. That by itself is an enormous effort. And Arjun says in the Bhagavad Gita that controlling the mind is like trying to control the wind. So controlling the mind itself is difficult, but when we learn to concentrate our minds, then we can focus our attention inward. And as he says, discover the innermost recesses of the minds, what psychologists would call the unconscious, right? Making that unconscious conscious, becoming aware of our own unconscious tendencies, the sanskars, which we have brought with us through many lifetimes, and that shape our character and shape our experience in the world. And then he says how to generalize their contents and form our own conclusions from them, right? How we can analyze what's happening in the mind. And then, of course, a next step beyond that would be actually transforming what's happening in the mind. Raja Yoga, therefore, never asks the question, back to Swamiji's quote, what our religion is, whether we are theists or atheists, whether Christians, Jewish, or Buddhists. We are human beings. That is sufficient. Every human being has the right and the power to seek for religion. Every human being has the right to ask the reason and to have their question answered by themselves if they only take the trouble. So for Swamiji, Raja Yoga is a form of self-inquiry. By practicing this type of meditation and concentration, we can find for ourselves what is the case and what is there already in our own minds and in our own consciousness. And as he says, this does not require any prior religious commitment. So the positions Swami Vivekananda is taking are extremely interesting, and one wishes he were here with us today to address some of the controversies that rage around yoga. So we just saw that Swamiji said, well, yoga is mainly mental, and so that would mean the focus primarily on the physical exercises and so on is misguided. Not that there's anything wrong with the exercises themselves, but they are not the whole point. They are in the service of this higher mental cultivation. And of course, that's what many people have been arguing today about yoga. On the other hand, you also sometimes see the argument made that because yoga comes from the Hindu tradition, this is something special to Hindus, other people shouldn't practice it, and so on. And Swamiji rejects that. He says you just have to be a human being to practice Raja Yoga, and of course to be serious about it and follow the practices. So he's taking some very interesting stands in terms of today's yoga controversies. For Swami Vivekananda, Raja Yoga is essential to experiencing truth directly for oneself. Only such experience counts, according to his teaching, as authentic religion. According to Swami Vivekananda, if you believe just on the word of someone else, that's not true religion. For Swami Vivekananda, he says, you have not even begun in the following of religion, in the path of religion, till you've actually had some kind of experience that is revealing these deeper truths to you for yourself. And this is also interesting because we tend to identify religion with faith in what someone else has taught. And of course, this is a big theme we find in Christianity, for example. Faith is, believing in something even though you have not seen it for yourself. Swami Vivekananda says, no, you need to see it for yourself. And the way to do that, one of the ways to do that, is Raja Yoga. Swami Vivekananda says, the powers of the mind should be concentrated and turn back upon itself, turn back upon the mind. And as the darkest places reveal their secrets before the penetrating rays of the sun, so will this concentrated mind penetrate its own innermost secrets. Thus will we come to the basis of belief, the real, genuine religion. We will perceive for ourselves whether we have souls, whether life is of 5 minutes or of eternity, whether there is a God in the universe or more. It will all be revealed to us. This is what Raja Yoga proposes to teach. So this is really quite revolutionary. It is saying, we have many religions that have proposed various ideas about the soul, about God, and so on. But let's find out for ourselves. And we can do this by going into the mind itself, by turning the power of the mind back upon itself. And he's also saying something that's very psychological, right? His lifetime overlapped a bit with that of Sigmund Freud. Freud is famous in the West, of course, for pioneering the idea of revealing what's in the unconscious through a kind of reflective process. But this idea is, of course, already very old in India, and this is what Swamiji is saying. But I think of Freud when I see this phrase, as the darkest places reveal their secrets before the penetrating rays of the sun, so will this concentrated mind penetrate its own innermost secrets. Swamiji is saying you don't have to go to a psychoanalyst necessarily. There's nothing wrong with that, but you can do it yourself. That going within, following this discipline, of course, it requires, as he says, a lot of effort and a lot of discipline. But we can find what is already there and present in our own mind. He says, what right has a man to say that he has a soul if he does not feel it, or that there is God if he does not see him? If there is a God, we must see him. If there is a soul, we must perceive it. Otherwise, it is better not to believe. It is better to be an outspoken atheist than a hypocrite. This kind of saying sometimes shocks people, right? We associate religion with sort of a very devout belief, but Swami Vivekananda has had a very penetrating mind, and he was not about simply believing things on the word of others. And he says, if you haven't experienced this for yourself, it's better not to believe it. Because he says it's a kind of hypocrisy, right? If we say, oh yes, oh God, oh, I believe in the soul. And if we really don't have a sense of that, if we've not actually perceived that for ourselves, we really don't have the right to say it. In fact, this reminds us of Swami Vivekananda's younger self, right? When he says, if there is a God, we must see him. If there's a soul, we must perceive it. Remember, he went around Calcutta asking the great minds, the great people, have you seen God? And this is a conviction he took with him throughout his life, that really perceiving these realities is what spirituality should be about, not simply believing and repeating what others have said, because we have no way really of then knowing if it's true. It's just been repeated a lot by other people, but it might be wrong. You have to experience it for yourself, and then you can say, yes, there's God because I've experienced God. There is a soul because I have experienced the soul. But one can only do that with a lot of discipline and practice, and that is what Raja Yoga is. He says religion is not only based upon the experience of ancient times, again, what others have said, but that no one can be religious until they have the same perceptions themselves. Yoga is the science which teaches us how to get those perceptions. And if you think of how difficult and how rigorous this discipline of yoga is, it really tells you that by Swami Vivekananda's definition, there are probably very few truly religious people in the world. That we have a lot of people simply repeating what they've heard and not necessarily experiencing it. Because of its capacity to lead to a direct experience of our divinity, Raja Yoga has the capacity, according to Swami Vivekananda, to remove all of our sufferings. Knowledge will take away all our misery. By analyzing our own mind, when we come face to face, as it were, with something which is never destroyed, something which is by its own nature eternally pure and perfect, we will no more be miserable and unhappy. Now, this is a very big claim, right? He is saying, no more unhappiness. What is he actually saying here? Is Swami Vivekananda saying that if you practice Raja Yoga, you won't have physical ailments, you won't have financial difficulties, everything will be great? No, he's not saying that. Our misery does not come from our external experiences. It doesn't come from being poor or being ill. Those things, of course, make us suffer, but they make us suffer because we allow them to. We identify with those experiences. And I had an experience myself, which I want to share with you, that I feel, for me at least, sheds light on this teaching. A couple of years ago, I broke my ankle. And I was at a conference and I fell. I fell and my foot hit the concrete and bent in the wrong direction, broke my bones, and I had to have surgery. I was in the hospital, and it took about more than a month before I could walk or do my normal activities. So it was certainly an unpleasant experience. And I think that if I had that experience maybe 20 years ago or 30 years ago when I was younger, I think I would have been devastated by it. But I had this experience just a couple of years ago, and I've been following this practice, and I don't claim to have perfected it, but it was comparatively easy for me to detach myself from that experience, to say, okay, this pain is in my foot, but I am not my foot. Right? And I was viewing it, the image I gave myself was, it was like looking at a distant star through a telescope. So it was something very, very far away, and I was simply observing it. Right? I was not that pain. I was the observer of the pain. And this made it much easier to cope. And I found that I was able to recover and all of that. And having the positive attitude that came from that detachment, for me, it made it much, much easier. And that's just a very small example, but it shows how we can actually use this philosophy to confront the things and detach ourselves from the things that typically cause us pain. So when he says this knowledge will take away all our misery, it doesn't mean your life is going to become perfect. It means that when you do have pain, it will no longer destroy you, right? An expression you could use is that pain is in the body, but suffering is in the mind, right? Misery is in the mind. And when we learn to control the mind, which is what Raja Yoga is, then we don't have to suffer misery, right? We may still have pain. Right? We'll have problems in life. These things happen. But they won't destroy us, because we will know that our true nature is, as he says, eternally pure and perfect. Why is it called Raja Yoga? So it's the word Raja is used for Swami Vivekananda. He calls it the royal path. Of course, this is a very, very old saying. But his understanding of what makes it the royal path is that it has the ability to sustain the other three yogas, as well as being a path to realization in its own right. In other words, when we say Raja Yoga, we're not saying this one's the best and all the others are not as good. No, they're all equal according to Swami Vivekananda. But a peculiar characteristic of this yoga is that by practicing Raja Yoga, by learning to control the mind, it becomes easier to do karma yoga, to do good work with detachment. It becomes easier to do bhakti yoga. You can focus your mind completely on God because you've learned how to focus the mind. Or jnana yoga, when you've cleared the mind and learned to focus the mind, knowledge and insight, of course, follow much more easily. So Raja Yoga supports and sustains all the other yogas. As Swamiji says here, Raja Yoga fits in with all other yogas. It fits inquirers of all classes with or without any belief, as we've said, and it is the real instrument of religious inquiry. As each science has its particular method of investigation, so is Raja Yoga the method of religion. This science also is variously applied according to various constitutions. So he's also pointing here again to the fact that it can be adapted to different types of personality. So you may be more inclined to karma yoga or bhakti yoga or jnana yoga, but Raja Yoga can still help you. It can still be of use. Now, when we get into Patanjali per se, right, Patanjali himself, the main characteristic of Patanjali's system of yoga, what people often look at, are the 8 limbs, the Ashtanga, and it's of course also called the Ashtanga Yoga. And so Swamiji interprets these 8 limbs, and he says some important things about each of them. Raja Yoga, he says, is divided into 8 steps. The first is yama. Yama, of course, are the 5 moral restraints of non-killing, truthfulness, non-stealing, continence, and non-receiving of any gifts. Non-receiving of gifts, that's a translation of aparigraha. I sometimes tell my students that interpreting it this way is especially appropriate for a monk because, according to Swamiji, if someone gives you a gift, then you have an obligation to them, and a monk should live free from such obligations. For householders, aparigraha, I would interpret it in the way it's interpreted in the Jain tradition specifically, is to not be greedy or fixated on material things at all. Next is niyama. So these are also 5 principles by which we should live: cleanliness, contentment, austerity, study, and self-surrender to God. Then comes asana, or posture, pranayama, or control of prana, pratyahara, or restraint of the senses from their objects, dharana, or fixing the mind on a spot, dhyana, or meditation, and samadhi, or superconsciousness. The yama and niyama, as we see, are moral trainings. Without these as the basis, no practice of yoga will succeed. As these 2 become established, the yogi will begin to realize the fruits of his practice. Without these, it will never bear fruit. A yogi must not think of injuring anyone by thought, word, or deed. Mercy shall not be for men alone, but shall go beyond and embrace the whole world. So this is also very, very important. When we think of yoga, again, very often in the Western world, we associate it with this kind of physical exercise. But it is a path to realization, and it requires us to have a strong moral foundation. As Swamiji says, without that moral foundation, the path will not bear fruit. And in fact, it's even dangerous, I would say, to practice yoga seriously without cultivating these moral virtues, the yama and niyama, because you, and Swamiji talks about this, you can have certain kinds of experiences, and the mind actually develops or cultivates certain latent powers, what are called the siddhis. And if one does that and is not firmly established in morality, one can actually end up using those abilities in a way that's very destructive for others and for oneself. And there are a lot of stories in various traditions about people who've done this and suffered great karmic consequences. So the mind is a very powerful thing, and it could be used as a weapon, it can be used as something constructive. And if you're going to develop that power, you have to do it with moral responsibility. So I really like Swami Vivekananda's emphasis on yama and niyama, and this is something that I think we always need to emphasize when we talk about yoga. Then we get into asana, or posture. Swamiji says the next step is asana, posture. A series of exercises, physical and mental, is to be gone through every day until certain higher states are reached. Therefore, it is quite necessary that we should find a posture in which we can remain long. The posture which is the easiest for one should be the one chosen. Now, this is interesting too, because so many complex asanas have been developed through the centuries, and they all have various kinds of virtues, both physical and mental. But the most important thing is that we be comfortable so that we can remain concentrated for a long period of time, so that the body does not become distracting. This is also what the Yoga Sutra itself says. Regarding pranayama, Swamiji emphasizes that prana does not mean merely breath, which is its literal translation. Breath, rather, he says, is a manifestation of the fundamental energy of the universe, which is what he means by prana. It's also called Shakti in Tantric tradition, and one must learn to master this in Raja Yoga. Pranayama is not, as many think, something about breath. Breath indeed has very little to do with it, if anything. Breathing is only one of the many exercises through which we get to the real pranayama. And prana is so important for Swami Vivekananda. Actually, 3 whole chapters of Raja Yoga are about prana. This is very much at the heart of his understanding of Raja Yoga. It's in his discussion of prana that Swamiji introduces tantric concepts like the chakras, the kundalini energy, the subtle nerve channels, and so on. He elaborates on all of this at great length in Raja Yoga. Swamiji characterizes the next step, pratyahara, in the following way. He characterizes pratyahara as checking the outgoing powers of the mind, freeing it from the thraldom of the senses. Right, so once you've mastered pranayama, then you begin pulling in the senses. In the Upanishads, there's a reference to pulling the senses in just like a turtle withdraws into its shell. Right? You take the focus off of material objects and start to direct it back to the mind. This is this concentration of the power of the mind on itself that Swamiji mentioned earlier. The next step, dharana, is characterized as placing the mind's attention where one wishes to place it, developing the power of concentration. Right? So our concentration tends to be diffused outward toward all of the sensory objects around us. And then we sometimes are able to focus it on something that we find interesting, and then it gets distracted again and moves to something else. So pratyahara means you pull in that attention, bring it inward, and then with dharana, you learn how to place it where you want it, so that it's not just floating about on its own. It is being done in a very deliberate way. And Swamiji talks about how in the higher forms of yoga, you may place your attention on the heart, for example, on the heart chakra, or between the eyebrows, right? Or wherever you need to place it in the particular practice that you're doing. Swamiji then writes of the last 2 stages of Raja Yoga, dhyana, meditation, and samadhi, absorption. He says, when the mind has been trained to remain fixed on a certain internal or external location, there comes to it the power of flowing in an unbroken current, as it were, towards that point. This state is called dhyana. When one has so intensified the power of dhyana as to be able to reject the external part of perception and remain meditating only on the internal part, the meaning that state is called samadhi. The 3, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, the last 3 of the limbs of yoga, together they're called sanyama. That is, if the mind can first concentrate upon an object and then is able to continue in that concentration for a length of time, then by continued concentration to dwell only on the internal part of the perception of which the object was the effect, everything comes under the control of such a mind. It's a very, very complex thing that Swamiji is saying here. We need to unpack it a little bit. The mind needs to concentrate on an object. That can be an external object. It can be your breath. It can be the heart. It can be the image of a devata. And then it continues that concentration, as he says, for a length of time. And then he says it dwells only on the internal part of the perception of which the object was the effect. In other words, you're looking at the object mentally, but in fact, that object is actually a manifestation of something more deeply within yourself. And you begin to focus not on that object, but on that inward reality, right? The internal part of the perception of which the object was the effect. And then he says everything comes under the control of such a mind. That is, all of our external objects are reflections of what's happening inwardly. If we are able to actually take control of what's happening inwardly, it can begin to affect what happens even outwardly. Swamiji characterizes samadhi, the highest stage of yoga, as follows. Just as unconscious work is beneath consciousness, so there's another work which is above consciousness, and which also is not accompanied with the feeling of egoism. The feeling of egoism is only on the middle plane, right? That's the waking state where we are most of the time. When the mind is above or below that line, there's no feeling of I, and yet the mind works. When the mind goes beyond this line of self-consciousness, it is called Samadhi, or superconsciousness. Now, one can ask, how is Samadhi different from just being unconscious? Outwardly, there may be no difference. Someone in Samadhi may appear unconscious. Because in both cases, there's no ego, as he says. So Swami Vivekananda explains this. How, for instance, do we know that a man in Samadhi has not gone below consciousness, has not degenerated instead of going higher? How do we know he's not just asleep? Right? In both cases, the works are unaccompanied with egoism. The answer is by the effects, by the results of the work. We know that which is below and that which is above. When a man goes into deep sleep, he enters a plane beneath consciousness. He works the body all the time. He breathes, he moves the body, perhaps in his sleep, without any accompanying feeling of ego. He is unconscious. And when he returns from his sleep, he's the same man who went into it. The sum total of the knowledge which he had before he went into the sleep remains the same. It does not increase at all. No enlightenment comes with it. But when a man goes into Samadhi, if he goes into it a fool, he comes out a sage. So by going into Samadhi, we touch the deepest part of the self. We come directly into contact with, we identify with the Atman, with the higher self, beyond the ego. So when you come back out of that state, you are suffused with the wisdom of that state. And Sri Ramakrishna, of course, is a prominent example of someone who frequently went to states of Samadhi. And even though he was not very educated in the traditional sense, he could explain to learned scholars the gist of the deepest scriptures, because he'd gone directly to the source of all of that knowledge through Samadhi. In conclusion, this is a wonderful quotation from the Raja Yoga, and I think it really sort of sums up what Swamiji was saying about this practice. He says, the yogi must always practice. He should try to live alone. The companionship of different sorts of people distracts the mind. He should not speak much, because to speak distracts the mind. Not work much, because too much work distracts the mind. The mind cannot be controlled after a whole day's hard work. One observing the above rules becomes a yogi. Such is the power of yoga that even the least of it will bring a great amount of benefit. It will not hurt anyone, but will benefit everyone. So that is the end of my formal presentation, and I'm now open to any questions. I turn the program back over to the moderators. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I would like to thank our distinguished speaker, Professor Jeffrey Long, sir, making excellent presentation and making this webinar very meaningful and fascinating to discover more. On behalf of entire Sanskrit department, Bankura University, I would like to express our deep gratitude to him for his presence. Sir, if anyone has any question in his or her mind, he or she can ask question related to the topic. Dear participant, if anyone has any question related to the topic, related to that topic, you can only ask question to Professor Jeffrey Long in English.
If you have problem in asking English, you can ask in Bangla, we can translate it. There is no problem.
Thank you. Yeah. Amar Bangla khub bhalo na, so.
No.
So
If
that
they're
would be
like,
great.
yeah.
Translate help.
Yeah, let's wait for some time. Let's see if there is any question or not.
ইউটিউবটা একবার চেক করে না
ইউটিউবে নেই, দীপজ্যোতি বললো। There is no question on YouTube.
If there's no question, that's either very good or very bad.
No, sir. People are saying. I'll just read out the comments.
Okay.
They're saying. Just a minute, sir.
Okay.
Yeah, they say that. So, very good session, informative seminar. Talk, knowledgeable talk. Very nice speech. That's their saying.
Very kind of you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Okay,
sir.
sir. Thank you.
And anything that was good in the talk was from Swamiji. So
Yes.
Yes.
Supriya will conclude the session.
Okay.
okay.
Okay. Once again, I thank you all for being with us this time. It has been a great pleasure. Thank you. End the session. So, namaskar.
Namaskar.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you all very much. Dhanyabad. Thank you very much.
নমস্কার
আমি বলবো
one question is there. Supriya,
yeah.
Oh, yes.
there is a question, I think. Deepjyoti like is presented.
Oh, how an average person is trying to those who are struggling with gross difficulties like property crisis, basic needs is simply a person who is.
Yes, that is a wonderful question. And there is so much suffering in our world. Right? There is poverty, disease, warfare, fear. So many things are happening. And we should be very careful when we talk about Raja Yoga, when we talk about Vedanta, when we talk about these things, that we're not dismissive of those things. Say, oh, just, change how your mind works and everything will be fine. No, it's very, very difficult. And if you are suffering from things like very severe poverty, for example, or serious disease or abuse, anything of that sort, it's going to be difficult to practice something like Raja Yoga, right? How can you go find time and be alone and do those things which Swamiji said when you're doing all of that? So I think if we, and Swamiji himself said that, if we really believe in these things and we want people to practice this, we need to all work together to create the social conditions that make it possible for people to practice something like Raja Yoga. So we all need to work together to alleviate poverty, to alleviate suffering. And of course, that kind of work is also one of the yogas, right? Karma yoga is the selfless service of God in the form of the suffering beings around us. So that also has to be done. All of these things, we're working on multiple levels simultaneously. So we need to be working to make our world better for everyone. And at the same time, we should be taking whatever time we can and doing Raja Yoga so that we are able to sustain that work. Because very often, we use this phrase in America, people get burned out, right? If you're doing this kind of work, trying to help others who are suffering, and if you don't have some inner resource to sustain that, people become frustrated, they become tired, they become discouraged, and they give up. And so we need to operate on both of these levels at the same time, work for a better world, while we're also doing the inner work on ourselves, and we need both of these. We one without the other is going to collapse. If you just do the inner work and don't do the outer work, then you're very selfish, right? You're just withdrawing, and maybe you might need to do that for a period of time. But if you never care about the suffering of others, then you're not really cultivating this higher egoless state. But if you're also doing that work and you're not doing the inner work, you're going to get exhausted and it won't last. So we need to be doing both at the same time, and we need to be helping those who need help, and help them to empower themselves. This is something else that Swami Vivekananda also believed in. He said, we can't really help anyone, but we can serve them and show them through our service how they can also live and help themselves, and give them that dignity, which is their birthright. So I think we have to be working on both of these levels at the same time. It's not enough to see someone who's suffering from poverty or illness or even great mental distress and say, oh, go do some Raja Yoga, you'll be fine. No, that's we need to do that too, but we also need to show compassion and serve others as best we can.
Thank you once again.
Thank you
For your priceless speech. A big thank you, sir, for your reports and presence. Okay, thank you, sir.
Difference between Raja Yoga and Hatha Yoga.
Okay, now that's very important. Swamiji also talks about Hatha Yoga. So Hatha Yoga is primarily, we're talking about then the physical practice, right? The asanas, the pranayama, that is really where Hatha Yoga is working. And Swamiji says Hatha Yoga is good. You can do a lot of good things with it. You can extend your life. It's good for health. But ultimately, he sees that should be in the service of the spiritual path. And so Raja Yoga is the more holistic concept, according to Swami Vivekananda, that if you're doing Hatha Yoga and you're not also, let's say, following Yama and Niyama, for example, you're not really doing proper yoga from his point of view. And then he says, people doing Hatha Yoga have been able to do remarkable things with their bodies. But then there's one place in the Complete Works where he compares that to circus tricks, right? He says, that's great, but if it doesn't help you get to God within, what's the point, right? So he would say that it's good, that it's helpful, but it should be in the service of the higher goal.
Sir, another question. In simply a person who is being to lower class of society, facing humiliation, exploitation by upper class, how can he or she feel the subtlety of yoga? How do you see?
This is very similar to the earlier question. I think those of us who have some privilege, I think we have an obligation to show service and respect to people like that, who are facing that kind of suffering. That it's not going to be easy at all, or maybe even possible for a person who's suffering in that way to be able to do this practice. So if we want everyone to do this practice, we need to remove that kind of humiliation and suffering. We need to, serve like I said, give service to such people, and teach them yoga, and really help them have a dignified life and not have that experience, right? So it's very, very hard. Now, of course, everyone is different. So you might have a very evolved soul who is born into that situation, and they may be able to face it very easily. They might have already cultivated these yogic abilities and endure it very well. But this is not the way human beings should live, right? And this is something Swamiji was very vocal about. He said that, we need to restore people's lost dignity, and people should not live with humiliation and exploitation. That needs to be, if we really are going to live and practice yogic values, we need to help create a world where everyone can do this practice. and not be excluded and not be humiliated. This is very, very important.
Thank you, sir, for his precious words. Have you any question? Any participants? Sir, another question. What is your opinion about yoga being commercialized into an instant use product?
Yes, and this is something I referred to a little bit. I think Swamiji would have very strong things to say about this. There are two aspects of this. And on the positive side, I think that if anyone learns even a little bit of yoga, even just some asana, it's probably going to do them some good if they do it properly. And we can hope that it will lead to the higher practices and a desire to learn more. However, on the negative side, this is very problematic because, like you said, it's commercialized. People are using this to make money. Now, we all have to make a living, so, it's okay to some extent. But it has made yoga very superficial. And you have a lot of people, again, especially in my country, who really have no idea what yoga really is. Like these higher teachings and this higher understanding is not something they're aware of at all. And so that is problematic. It's being lost. And in fact, I'd like to connect this with the earlier question about people facing humiliation and exploitation and so on. This kind of commercialization of yoga makes yoga something for rich people, right? It makes something for people who can afford to buy a yoga mat and yoga pants and a yoga candle and go to a yoga studio, all of this paraphernalia. And, the Buddha did not need a yoga mat, right? he achieved Samadhi sitting under the tree in Bodh Gaya. Sri Ramakrishna did not need to go to a yoga studio. Right? So this commercialization and superficialization of yoga goes hand in hand with an exploitative society because you have a situation where you have yoga haves and have-nots, right? People who can afford to sort of purchase these things and practice what they think is yoga, while other people are being excluded. So I think these two go together. I think, again, it requires us to work for a society where everyone has access to all of these things. And sure, people can make money. I mean, again, that's just, part of life, but it's excessive, right? It's excessive. It's become, $1 billion industry. So I think it's very problematic. That being said, I don't think we should deny yoga teaching to anyone, right? Anybody who wants to learn should learn. Whatever they do is hopefully going to do some good. I think someone also asked a question about how to achieve Samadhi, the Samadhi stage during our human lifetime. And that is the whole of Raja Yoga, right? The answer to that question is, the yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, right? Those are the stages, right? That by practicing that, by learning to draw the mind inward, by learning to concentrate it on one spot, by concentrating it upon itself, one will eventually penetrate through and reach that stage of samadhi. So the answer to the question just is Raja Yoga, right? That's how to achieve the samadhi stage. There's no trick, right? There's no sort of secret. It's all been presented by Patanjali and by Swami Vivekananda.
Again, sir, thank you, sir, for your presence and efforts. Okay.
Thank you.
Any other question? Thank you, sir.
Okay, it's a good question. How should we deal with our materialistic consumption in the light of yoga? So I think if we practice yoga very seriously, we'll find that our desire for material things will gradually lessen. And there's a symbiotic relationship there too. If we're serious about practicing yoga, we do need to withdraw from material things a bit. And it's going to be difficult, right? So if we say, okay, we have to get rid of everything. Now, some people, that's the way they do it, right? They renounce the world, they give everything away, and they focus wholeheartedly on yoga, and they probably get samadhi in that very lifetime. For most of us, it's a matter of reducing, our materialistic consumption, not giving it up completely because that's just too difficult for us in this age, but reducing. If we see something that I would really like that, and then ask ourselves, do I need that? Is that important? And then as you continue practicing yoga, you start to get a more sense of proportionality of what is important. And then you'll find that materialistic desire just sort of becoming less and less really all by itself, to the point where you will be happy to just give up everything because you know that nothing in this world is really ours in any case, right? We are only the self. So I think it's a process. It's a process that involves both consciously reducing our materialism, but then also cultivating yoga at the same time.
Thank you, sir, for your precious words. Then a big thank you, sir, for your presence. And last, once again, I thank you all for being with us this time. It has been a great pleasure, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the great questions.
So according to Raja Yoga, how can we control our sense organ and of action, mind, our emotions?
Yes, so this comes from the power of concentration, which Swamiji talks about, that when we are able to place our attention where we want to place it, rather than having it sort of unconsciously dragged along, then we're able to control the sensory organs, the mind, the emotions, all of those things. Now, again, this is a gradual process, but it involves this ability to direct attention. What happens to most of us is our attention, it's like a lamp. I have a lamp, a light here in my room. The light is diffused. It just goes everywhere. And that's how our attention typically is. It's all over the place, right? And that's true of, we're focused on the outward physical world and also the contents of our minds. And in yoga, what we learn to do is to concentrate that light. So instead of a lamp, imagine a laser beam, right? All of that light concentrated on one spot. As you develop that through the practice, you could point, it's like the laser pointer, you could point it where you want it to be. And something's happening in the sensory organs, like a broken leg, for example. So you can direct the attention in a different place. Someone says something unpleasant to you. Well, you can direct the attention to something else and focus it where you want to focus it. So that requires developing the concentration. And that means regularly doing this practice of concentrating the mind on just one place. And that can be our own breathing, in fact. We could just focus on the breath. If you do a little bit of breath control every day, it's going to get easier to place your attention where you want it, to choose how you respond to what happens to you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Any question? Okay, sir. No question.
Oh, okay.
Sir, thank you for your presence.
Today. Now,
Thank you.
Enough.
Okay.
again, thank you, sir. Pranam. Namaskar.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Pranam.
Pranam. Okay.
Jai Shri Ramakrishna.
Jai Shri Ram. Meet you once again.
Thank you.
Okay.